Hi, everybody. We are going to read another pop-up book today, and today's is Roald Dahl's Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. It's the pop-up version. So again, I want to thank our publisher for letting us do this while we're home and away from our precious library. Our publisher here is Penguin, so I appreciate Penguin letting us read when normally this is not allowed. So this is a little bit long. It'll probably end up being half an hour. So if that's too long for one sitting for you, you can stop it wherever you want and then pick it up and watch the rest later. But it's good to do this in one sitting just because the pop-ups are so cool. So I'll make sure to turn them so you guys can see them all. All right, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So even if you've already seen the movie or read the book on your own, this one's pretty fun because of the pop-up. So when we turn this one, and then it says, here comes Charlie, and he's waving. Oh. These very old people are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. There's Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket and this is Mrs. Bucket, and they have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. And this is Charlie. How do you do, and how do you do, and how do you do again? He is pleased to meet you. That's why he's waving. The whole of his family, the 6 grown-ups and little Charlie Bucket, lived together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. There wasn't any question about them being able to buy a better house. They were far too poor for that. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Every one of them went about from morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage. The one thing he longed for, more than anything else, was chocolate. All right, this next one's pretty cool. Are you ready? So I'm going to open it and then turn it, and there is the factory, the chocolate factory. To turn it so I can read it now. I haven't yet told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie more than anything else. In the town, actually within sight of his house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. And it wasn't simply an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in the whole world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates there has ever been. Twice a day on his way to and from school, little Charlie had to walk right past the gates, and every time he went by, he would walk very slowly and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell. Let's see if I can show you better. And oh, how he wished he could go inside that factory and see what it was like. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said, "Is Mr. Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the whole world?" "My dear boy," cried Grandpa Joe, "did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 kinds of chocolate bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make?" "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine, "and he sends them to all the 4 corners of the earth." Just then Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, came into the room waving a newspaper. "Have you heard the news? People are actually going to be allowed to go inside the factory." And so here's the newspaper. And it says, "Evening Bulletin, Wonka Factory to be opened at last. Lucky few. I, Willy Wonka, have decided to allow 5 children, just 5, mind you, and no more, to visit my factory this year. These lucky 5 will be shown around personally by me, and then at the end of the tour, as a special present, all of them will be given enough chocolates and sweets to last them for the rest of their lives. So watch out for the golden tickets hidden underneath the wrapping paper of 5 ordinary bars of chocolate. Good luck to you all, and happy hunting." And it's signed Willy Wonka. "Just imagine! The whole world will be searching for those golden tickets," cried Grandpa Joe. "Oh, how exciting it would be! Wouldn't it be something, Charlie, to open a bar of chocolate and see a golden ticket glistening inside?" "It certainly would, Grandpa," said Charlie. There's our factory. It even has the back of the factory on the back side there. It's pretty cool. All right. This one is the 4 finders, and this is where we meet the first 4 people who find the first 4 golden tickets. So this has some flaps that I'll turn and some things that move here. So this one right here is our first guy, and this is the Morning Herald, the newspaper. Do you see his right there? Ticket moves. Oh. The very next day, the first golden ticket was found. The finder was a boy called, does anyone remember? Augustus Gloop, and Mr. Bucket's newspaper carried a large picture of him on the front page. The picture showed a 9-year-old boy who was so enormously fat he looked as though he had been blown up with a powerful pump. Great flabby folds of fat bulged out from every part of his body, and his face was like a monstrous ball of dough with 2 small, greedy, curranty eyes peeping out upon the world. The town in which Augustus Gloop lived, the newspaper said, had gone wild with excitement over their hero. And it says, "Golden ticket found. I just knew Augustus would find a golden ticket. He eats so many bars of chocolate a day that it was almost impossible for him not to find one." You know, eating is his hobby. That's all he's interested in. And what I always say is he wouldn't go on eating like that unless he needed the nourishment, would he? It's all vitamins anyway. What a thrill it will be for him to visit Mr. Wonka's marvelous factory. So when we turn, then you can see our next girl over here. "What a revolting woman," said Grandma Josephine. "And what a repulsive boy," said Grandma Georgina. "Only 4 golden tickets left," said Grandpa George. "I wonder who will get those." And now the whole country, indeed the whole world, seemed suddenly to be caught up in a mad chocolate-buying spree. Everybody searching for those precious remaining tickets. Suddenly, on the day before Charlie Bucket's birthday, the newspapers announced that the second golden ticket had been found. The lucky person was a small girl called Veruca Salt, who lived with her rich parents. Once again, Mr. Bucket's newspaper carried a big picture of the finder, and it says, "Second golden ticket winner, girl's father explains his method. You see, boys, I went out and started buying all the Wonka bars I could lay my hands on, thousands of them. I had them loaded onto trucks and sent to my own factory. But 3 days went by and we had no luck. My little Veruca would lie for hours on the floor, kicking and yelling, 'I want my golden ticket!' Now she's all smiles, and we have a happy home once again." We read that already. That evening, Mr. Bucket's newspaper announced the finding of not only the 3rd golden ticket, but the 4th as well. "All right," said Grandpa Joe, "let's hear who found them." So here's the next one. The evening news says 2 golden tickets found today. And I'll turn it this way. If I lift that up, and it shows the next 2. Only one more left. The 3rd ticket was found by Miss Violet Beauregard. There was great excitement in the Beauregard household when our reporter arrived to interview the young lady. I'm a gum chewer normally, but when I heard about these tickets from Mr. Wonka, I gave up gum and started on chocolate in the hope of striking lucky. Now I'm back on gum. I just adore gum. I can't do without it. I munch on it all day long, except for a few minutes at meal times when I take it out and stick it behind my ear. I used to change my piece of gum once a day in our lift on the way home from school. I like the gooey sticky piece I like to stick the gooey piece onto the control buttons. Then the next person who pressed the button got my old gum on the end of his or her finger. Ha! What a racket they kicked up. I'm thrilled to be going to Mr. Wonka's factory. He's going to give me enough gum to last the rest of my life. Woohoo! She's a little obnoxious. "Beastly girl," said Grandma Josephine. "And who got the 4th golden ticket?" Charlie asked. "Another bad lot, I'll be bound," muttered Grandma Josephine. So here's our 4th one. It says, "News Extra, golden ticket number 4. Now it says polls. Are you ready? And it just exposes another little passage underneath there. And it also shows, watch him. And then when I move this, you can see a little bit different part over here. The 4th golden ticket was found by a boy called Mike Teavee. Now, if you've seen the movie or remember this story, where's his name? They spell it Teavee, but he's obsessed with the TV, the television, so that's why they gave him the name Teavee. The 4th golden ticket was found by a boy called Mike Teavee. The Teavee household was crammed with excited visitors when our reporter arrived, but young Mike Teavee, the lucky winner, seemed extremely annoyed by the whole business. "Can't you fools see I'm watching television?" he said angrily. "I wish you wouldn't interrupt." The 9-year-old boy was seated before an enormous television with his eyes glued to the screen, and he was watching a film in which one bunch of gangsters was shooting another bunch of gangsters with machine guns. And that's what he's got, like toy guns there. Quiet, he shouted when someone tried to ask him a question. Didn't I tell you not to interrupt? This show's an absolute whiz-banger. I watch it every day. I watch all of them every day, even the rotten ones. They were there to interview him, but he didn't have time to be interviewed. Now there's only one ticket left, said Grandpa George. And just as sure as I'll be having cabbage soup for supper tomorrow, sniffed Grandma Georgina, that ticket'll go to some nasty little beast who doesn't deserve it. The whole thing in this story is that the first 4 kids are pretty rude and awful, and Charlie lasts the longest because he's the most well-behaved and he listens, and he's the kindest, and of course that's why we're so happy when he gets it at the end. All right, our next one is labeled The Miracle. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. A freezing gale blew. The excitement over the golden tickets had been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. Then one afternoon, walking home with the icy wind in his face, Charlie's eye caught something lying in the snow. It was a 50-cent piece. Carefully, Charlie pulled it out. It meant one thing to him at that moment. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving toward the nearest shop. He would buy 1 luscious bar of chocolate and eat it all up, and the rest of the money he would give to his mother. The man behind the counter looked fat and well-fed. I think, said Charlie quietly, I think I'll have one of those chocolate bars. Why not? The shopkeeper said, taking a Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mellow Delight from the shelf. Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper. Suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there came a brilliant flash of gold. Charlie's heart stood still. It's a golden ticket, screamed the shopkeeper. You found the last golden ticket. Hey, would you believe it? Charlie felt quite dizzy. Take it straight home quickly before you lose it. Run all the way and don't stop till you get there. You understand? Thank you, Charlie said, and off he went, running as fast as his legs could go. 5 minutes later, he arrived home. Mother, yelled Charlie, rushing in like a hurricane. It's the 5th golden ticket, and I've found it. Mrs. Bucket simply stared. Grandpa Joe threw up his arms and yelled, Yippee! Let me see it, Charlie, Mr. Bucket said. Read it aloud, said Grandpa Joe. Mr. Bucket held the lovely golden ticket up close to his eyes. His hands were trembling. He cleared his throat and he said, all right, I'll read it. Here we go. So this is the chocolate bar, and it says Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight, 100% world-famous chocolate. But when we open the wrapper, we have, I gotta move my hands so I can do that here. There's our chocolate bar. See how it's thick like it's the actual chocolate bar there? It's pretty cool. It's actually like the size of a real candy bar. And then this is the golden ticket inside the candy bar. And it says, greetings to you, the lucky finder of this golden ticket from Mr. Willy Wonka. I shake you warmly by the hand. Tremendous things are in store for you. Many wonderful surprises await you. In your wildest dreams, you could not imagine that such things could happen to you. Just wait and see. The day I have chosen for the visit is the first day in the month of February. You must come to the factory gates at 10 o'clock sharp. Don't be late. Willy Wonka. All right, so we're going to close our candy bar up. Mr. Bucket said, now, who's going to go with Charlie to the factory? I will, shouted Grandpa Joe. I'll take him. I'll look after him. You leave it to me. All right, this next one's pretty cool. So this is when they all go, all the golden ticket winners, to the factory. Whoa. Pretty cool, huh? Let's see, what does that say over here? It says, the big day arrives. You could see all 5 of the winners that we've already met. And their family there. Of course, Charlie and our grandpa are up front here. All right. The sun was shining brightly on the morning of the big day, but turn it so you can see it here, but the ground was still white with snow. Outside the gates of Wonka's factory, enormous crowds of people had gathered to watch the 5 lucky ticket holders going in. The excitement was tremendous. Right beside the gate stood the 5 famous children, together with the grown-ups who'd come with them. Charlie gave Grandpa Joe's hand a squeeze, and the old man looked down at Charlie and smiled. Somewhere in the somewhere in the distance, a church clock began striking 10. Very slowly, with a loud creaking of rusty hinges, the iron gates of the factory began to swing open. The crowd became suddenly silent. The children stopped jumping about. All eyes were fixed upon the gates. "There he is!" somebody shouted. "That's him!" And so it was. Mr. Wonka was standing all alone just inside the open gates of the factory, and what an extraordinary little man he was. He had a black top hat on his head. He wore a tailcoat made of beautiful plum-colored velvet. His trousers were bottle green. His gloves were pearly gray, and in one hand he carried a fine gold-topped walking cane. And his eyes were most marvelously bright. His whole face was alight with fun and laughter. And oh, how clever he looked, how quick and sharp and full of life. Suddenly he did a funny little skipping dance in the snow, and he spread his arms wide, and he smiled at the 5 children and called out, "Welcome, my little friends, welcome to the factory. Will you come forward one at a time, please, and bring your parents? Then show me your golden ticket and give me your name." The big fat boy stepped up. "I'm Augustus Gloop," he said. "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, "my dear boy, how good to see you. Delighted, charmed, overjoyed to have you with us. And these are your parents? Come in, come in." Mr. Wonka was as excited as everyone else. "My name," said the next child to go forward, "is Veruca Salt." "My dear Veruca, how do you do? What a pleasure. You do have an interesting name, don't you? I always thought a verruca was a sort of wart that you got on the sole of your foot, but I must be wrong. Dear me, this is such an exciting day. I do hope you enjoy it." The next 2 children, Violet Beauregard and Mike Teavee, came forward to have their tickets examined and to have their arms particularly pumped off their shoulders by the energetic Mr. Wonka. And last of all, a small, nervous voice whispered, "Charlie Bucket." "Charlie," cried Mr. Wonka. "Well, well, well, so there you are. You're the one who found your ticket only yesterday, aren't you?" Yes, I read all about it in this morning's papers. Just in time, my dear boy. I'm so glad. I'm so happy for you. And this is your grandfather. Delighted to meet you, sir. Excellent. Is everybody in now? 5 children? Good. Now, will you please follow me? Our tour is about to begin, but do keep up together. Please don't wander off. I shouldn't like to lose any of you at this stage of the proceedings. Oh, dear me, no." Charlie glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great iron gates slowly closing behind him. Charlie took a last look, and then as the gates closed with a clang, all sight of the outside world disappeared. Right, so the next one isn't so big, but we will read a little over here, and then we will open up and get some pop-ups in there. So this is, "Here we are," cried Mr. Wonka. Trotting along in front of the group, Charlie found himself in a long corridor that stretched away in front of him. "How lovely and warm," whispered Charlie. "And what a marvelous smell," answered Grandpa Joe, taking a long, deep sniff. All the most wonderful smells in the world seemed to be mixed up in the air around them. Melting chocolate and mint and violets and apple blossom and caramel. The place was like a gigantic rabbit warren with passages leading this way and that in every direction. And suddenly Mr. Wonka stopped. In front of him was a shiny metal door. On the door in large letters it said, "The Chocolate Room." "An important room, this," cried Mr. Wonka. "This is the nerve center of the whole factory, the heart of the whole business, and so beautiful. I insist upon my rooms being beautiful. I can't abide ugliness in factories. In we go, then, but do be careful, my dear children. Don't lose your heads. Don't get overexcited. Keep very calm." Mr. Wonka opened the door. 5 children and 9 grown-ups pushed their way in, and oh, what an amazing sight it was that met their eyes. So then, if we open it, kind of see, there's our Mr. Wonka. The trees are pop-ups up there. You can see the chocolate river. All right, now we're going to read over here. They were looking down upon a lovely valley. Let's see what you can see there. There were green meadows on either side, and along the bottom there flowed a great brown river with tremendous waterfall halfway along. There, cried Mr. Wonka, pointing his cane. It's all chocolate. Every drop of that river is hot melted chocolate of the very finest quality. There's enough chocolate in there to fill every bathtub in the entire country. The children and their parents were too flabbergasted to speak. The waterfall is most important, Mr. Wonka went on. No other factory mixes chocolate by waterfall. And do you like my trees? Of course they are all edible. The grass is made of kind of soft, minty sugar that I've just invented. Try a blade, please do. Suddenly screams of excitement came from Veruca Salt. Look! It's a little person! It's a little man! The tiny men, they were no larger than medium-sized dolls, were staring back across the river at the visitors. They can't be real people, Charlie said. Of course they're real, Mr. Wonka answered. They're Oompa Loompas. They're wonderful workers. They love dancing and music. I expect you will hear a good deal of singing today. I must warn you, though, they are rather mischievous. Over here now. Augustus, cried Mrs. Gloop. I don't think you had better do that. Augustus Gloop had sneaked down to the river and was scooping chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. When Mr. Wonka turned and saw what he was doing, he cried out, Augustus, you must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. Suddenly there was a splash, and into the river went Augustus Gloop. In 1 second he had disappeared. Save him! Screamed Mrs. Gloop. He'll drown! He can't swim! Okay, so let's see if I can hold this. If you watch, there's Augustus. Oh, there he goes. And I'll read that. Down there it says, the Oompa Loompas song, Goodbye Augustus. So we'll read that in a second. Mr. Wonka clicked his fingers sharply. Immediately, an Oompa Loompa appeared. I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop to the fudge room and help them find their son, Augustus. He's just gone up the pipe, said Mr. Wonka. Mr. and Mrs. Gloop and their tiny escort hurried away. Off we go, cried Mr. Wonka. Follow me to the next room. The Oompa Loompas began hopping about. They're going to sing us a song, whispered Grandpa Joe. All right, so here, pull that down. And then if I lift that up, there's the song. I'm not really going to sing it. I'm just going to kind of read it. And I have to tell you that back when this movie, the first came out, not the one with Johnny Depp in it. That's a remake. But the original one with Wilder. I forget his first name. You parents know, with Wilder. That was new when I was like your age in elementary school. And I went, I was, for Halloween that year, I was an Oompa Loompa. And I had the coolest homemade costume. And they painted my face green and everything. Or purple, I guess. I can't remember. I think they were green. All right, Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, the great big greedy nincompoop. How long could we allow this beast to gorge and guzzle, feed and feast on everything he wanted to? Great Scott, it simply wouldn't do. Come on, we cried, the time is ripe to send him shooting up the pipe. But don't, dear children, be alarmed. Augustus Gloop will not be harmed. Although, of course, we must admit he will be altered quite a bit. He'll be quite changed from what he's been when he goes through the fudge machine. Then out he comes, and now by grace a miracle has taken place. This boy who only just before was loathed by men from shore to shore, this greedy brute, this louse's ear, is loved by people everywhere. For who could hate or bear a grudge against a luscious bit of fudge? So he's actually transformed into a piece of fudge. All right, and our next girl, this is what happens to her. It says the inventing room. Do you remember who that is? What happens to her? If you don't know, we'll find out in a second. See her little face up there? Mr. Wonka shouted, "Stop!" alongside a red door, and on the door it said the inventing room. Private, keep out. This is the most important room in the entire factory, he said. All my most secret inventions are simmering in here. No touching and no tasting. Charlie Bucket stared. The place was like a witch's kitchen. All about him pots were bubbling and boiling and strange machines were clanking and spluttering. The place was filled with smoke and steam and delicious smells. Mr. Wonka led the party over to a gigantic machine and pressed 3 different buttons. The machine let out a mighty groan and a tiny drawer popped out. In it lay something small and thin and gray. Violet Beauregard let out a yell. "By gum, it's gum!" she shrieked. "Right you are," cried Mr. Wonka. "It's the most amazing and fabulous gum in the world. That little strip is a whole 3-course dinner." That sounds pretty awful to me. I don't like gum anyway, but that sounds pretty terrible. "What? It's tomato soup, roast beef, and blueberry pie?" asked Violet. "If you were to start chewing it," said Mr. Wonka, "then this is exactly what you would get. It's amazing. You can actually feel the food going down into your tummy." "Come on, Mr. Wonka," said Violet. "Hand over this magic gum and we'll see if it works." "I would rather you didn't take it," Mr. Wonka told her gently. "You see, I haven't got it quite right yet." Suddenly, before Mr. Wonka could stop her, Violet grabbed the gum and popped it into her mouth, which was very rude, right? Because he told her that it wasn't ready and he told her not to take it. But again, this is what happens to her because she did not follow directions and she did whatever she wanted, even though she was told not to do it. At once, her well-trained jaws started chewing. "Fabulous!" shouted Violet. "Tomato soup, it's hot and creamy. And roast beef, it's changing. Blueberry pie and cream, here it comes. Oh my, it's the most marvelous blueberry pie in the world." Mr. Wonka was wringing his hands. He's doing this like he's nervous. No, it isn't ready for eating." "Good heavens!" shrieked Mrs. Beauregard, suddenly staring at Violet. "What's happening to your nose? It's turning blue." Violet's face and hands and legs and neck had turned a brilliant purplish blue. "I feel most peculiar," gasped Violet. "Great heavens, girl!" screeched Mrs. Beauregard. "You're blowing up like a balloon." "It's not like a balloon, like a blueberry," said Mr. Wonka. There was no saving her now. Her body was changing shape at such a rate that within a minute it had turned into an enormous blue ball, a gigantic blueberry, in fact. "It always happens like that," sighed Mr. Wonka. "I've tried it on 20 Oompa Loompas and every one finished up as a blueberry. I can't understand it." "I don't want a blueberry for a daughter," yelled Mrs. Beauregard. "You put her back to what she was this instant." Mr. Wonka clicked his fingers and 10 Oompa Loompas appeared. "Roll Miss Beauregard along to the juicing room. Don't worry, we'll get her repaired." You see this right here? Let's see. I think maybe that one's not working because this is supposed to turn. Oh no, there's no lock. She just turns there. Do you see her? Mr. and Mrs. Beauregard hurried after them. Well, sighed Mr. Wonka. 2 naughty children gone. 3 good children left. Remember, that's what his whole plan was, is to find the good kid out of the 5 who will be able to do a good job listening, and then they get the special prize at the end. "Listen, Grandpa," whispered Charlie. "The Oompa Loompas are starting to sing." Okay, so we're going to come out over here. And it says the Oompa Loompa song, "Goodbye, Violet." All right, I'm going to read that. "Dear friends, we surely all agree that there's almost nothing worse to see than some repulsive little bum who's always chewing gum. The chewer to a sticky end. This sticky habit's about to send the chewer to a sticky end. Did any of you ever know a person called Miss Bigelow? This dreadful woman saw no wrong in chewing all day long. For years and years she chewed away, consuming 50 bits a day, until one summer's eve, alas, a horrid business came to pass. Miss Bigelow went late to bed. For half an hour she lay and read, chewing all the while, like some great clockwork crocodile. At last she put her gum away upon a special little tray. But now, how strange, although she slept, those massive jaws of hers still kept on chewing through the night, even with nothing there to bite, until at last her jaws decide to pause and open extra wide, and with the most tremendous chew, they bit the lady's tongue in 2. Thereafter, just from chewing gum, Miss Bigelow was always dumb, and that is why we'll try so hard to save Miss Violet Beauregard, provided she survives the cure. We hope she does, but we can't be sure. All right, so here's their next adventure, and this one is the nut room. Do you remember what happens in the nut room? See if I pull this over here. Whoa. There she goes. All right. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. Right, said Mr. Wonka. Stop here for a moment and take a peek, but don't go in. You'll disturb the squirrels, whatever you do. Don't go into the nut room. He warned them. Everyone crowded around the door. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools. There were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts. Mummy, shouted Veruca Salt suddenly, get me one of those squirrels. I want a squirrel. They're not for sale, Mr. Wonka answered. She can't have one. Who says I can't? Shouted Veruca. I'm going to get myself one this very minute. Don't, said Mr. Wonka, but he was too late. The girl had already rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and stared at her. Her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her. All right, Veruca said, I'll have you. She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel, but as she did so, every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap toward her. One climbed onto her shoulder and started tapping the wretched girl's head. Save her, screamed Mrs. Salt. What are they doing to her? They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut, said Mr. Wonka. At once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. My goodness, she is a bad nut after all, said Mr. Wonka. Where are they taking her? Shrieked Mrs. Salt. She's going where all the other bad nuts go, said Mr. Wonka. Down the rubbish chute. And there she goes. Rubbish. Both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor. Veruca, shouted Mrs. Salt, are you down there? She needed only one tiny little push, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled into the hole. Good gracious me, said Mr. Salt. The squirrels rushed up behind him. Help, he shouted, but he was already toppling forward. Down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. Oh dear, cried Charlie. I expect someone will catch them at the bottom, said Mr. Wonka. Shall we move on? And they just leave them. Listen, said Grandpa Joe, here comes another song. All right, so that one says the Oompa Loompa song, Goodbye, Veruca. Veruca Salt, the little brute, has just gone down the rubbish chute. Down goes Veruca down the drain, and here perhaps we should explain that when she will meet as she descends a rather difficult set of friends. A rotten nut, a reeky pear, a thing the cat left on the stair, and lots of other things as well, each with a rather horrid smell. But now, my dears, we think you might be wondering, is it really right? For though she's spoiled, and dreadfully so, a girl can't spoil herself, you know. Who spoiled her then? Ah, who indeed? Who pandered to her every need? Who turned her into such a brat? Who are the culprits? Who did that? They are, and this is very sad, her loving parents, Mum and Dad, and that is why we're glad they fell into the rubbish chute as well. All right, our next one, you know who's left, is our boy Teavee, right? And so this is the television room. So I won't move this one yet. When I get to it in the story, you'll have to see what happens to this picture when I pull that. It's pretty cool. I've never seen anything like it, cried Mr. Wonka. The children are disappearing like rabbits. He skipped across the passage to a pair of double doors. Now, I want everybody to be careful in this room. There is dangerous stuff in here, and you must not tamper with it. The Teavee family, together with Charlie and Grandpa Joe, stepped into a room so bright and dazzling white that they screwed up their eyes in pain. Mr. Wonka handed each of them a pair of dark glasses. There was an enormous camera on wheels, and an Oompa Loompa wearing a spacesuit was gazing at the screen of a very large television. Here we go, cried Mr. Wonka. This is the testing room for my very latest and greatest invention, television chocolate. I shall now send a bar of chocolate from one end of this room to the other by television. 4 Oompa Loompas marched forward carrying the most enormous bar of chocolate. And there they are. You can see how big the chocolate bar is. One of the Oompa Loompas caught hold of a large switch and pulled it down, and there was a blinding flash. The chocolate's gone, shouted Grandpa Joe. Suddenly a small bar of chocolate appeared in the middle of the television screen. Take it, shouted Mr. Wonka. Charlie put out his hand, and the bar of chocolate came away in his fingers. Okay, so if you watch right here, this is what's doing the magic. Right, now watch. There's our boy Teavee, and here's the TV screen. So when I pull this... See there? Okay, there's no chocolate bar here, right? And there's he is with all his gear. Now watch what happens. he disappears and he shows up on the TV screen. You see that? Because he got in the way. It was supposed to transfer the chocolate bar, which is still over here. They were going to put the chocolate bar up here and it would change from big and then it would show up on the screen. But because he didn't listen and he got in the way, he ends up over here inside the TV screen. Eat it, shouted Mr. Wonka. It'll be delicious. It's the same bar, it just got smaller in the journey, that's all. Well, what about people? Asked Mike Teavee. A person, cried Mr. Wonka. Are you off your rocker? But could it be done? Could you send a real person live from one place to the other? Good heavens, child. Well, I suppose I could. Mike Teavee was already off and running toward where the great camera was standing. Look at me, he shouted. I'm going to be the first person in the world to be sent by television. No, 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 cried Mr. Wonka. But there was no stopping Mike Teavee. The crazy boy rushed on and leapt out into the full glare of the mighty lens. There was a blinding flash. Mike, screamed Mrs. Teavee. He's gone. But there he is. Hold everything, said Mr. Wonka. Watch the screen. Something's happening. Slowly the screen began to flicker as Mike Teavee appeared. Hi, Pop, look at me! He was no more than an inch tall. He shrunk, said Mr. Teavee. Of course he shrunk, said Mr. Wonka. This is terrible, wailed Mrs. Teavee. What are you going to do? Well, said Mr. Wonka, we'll put him in a special machine for testing the stretchiness of chewing gum. Maybe that will bring him back to what he was. He clicked his fingers. An Oompa Loompa appeared immediately. Follow these orders, said Mr. Wonka, handing him instructions. Goodbye, Mr. Teavee. Goodbye, Mrs. Teavee. Little Charlie caught Grandpa's hand, and the two of them stood beside Mr. Wonka, listening to the Oompa Loompas singing. All right, so here's Goodbye, Mike Teavee. The most important thing we've learned, so far as children are concerned, is never, never, never let them near your television set. In almost every house we've been, we've watched them gaping at the screen. They loll and slop and lounge about and stare until their eyes pop out. It rots the senses in the head. It kills imagination dead. All right, you cry. All right, you say. But if we take this set away, what shall we do to entertain our darling children? Please explain. Have you forgotten? Don't you know? We'll say it loud and very slow. They used to read. They'd read and read and read and read and read and then proceed to read some more. The nursery shelves held books galore. Such wondrous, fine, fantastic tales of dragons, gypsies, queens, and whales, and treasure isles and distant shores where smugglers rowed with muffled oars. And once they start, oh boy, you'll watch their slowly growing joy. They'll wonder where they'd ever seen and what they'd ever seen in that ridiculous machine. That nauseating, foul, unclean, repulsive television screen. P.S. Regarding Mike Teavee, we very much regret that we simply have to wait and see. They don't know if they're able to fix them. All right, this one's pretty cool. All right, so you know who's left, right? And there it says, the Great Glass Elevator. Huge. And if you didn't know, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator is the sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. We have that book at the library. Actually, it used to be my boys, and I had it here, and I could have read it to you, but I had already donated it to the library, so it's at school now. All right, which room shall it be next? Said Mr. Wonka. We must get going. How many children are left now? Little Charlie looked at Grandpa Joe. But, Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe called after him, there's only Charlie left. Mr. Wonka swung around and stared at Charlie. There was a silence. Charlie stood there holding tightly onto Grandpa Joe's hand. But, my dear boy, he cried out, that means you've won! I had a hunch it was going to be you. Well done, Charlie. This is terrific. He started shaking Charlie's hand so furiously it nearly came off. Now the fun is really going to start, but we mustn't dilly, we mustn't dally. Luckily for us, we'll have the great glass lift to speed things up. So this is he's a British author, Roald Dahl, and so you might have noticed a few words are a little bit different than what we say, and so they use the word lift more commonly for elevator. We say elevator, they say lift. Let's see. You too, Grandpa Joe, sir. Mr. Wonka was reaching for a button high up on the glass ceiling of the lift. It said, up and out. The great glass doors closed. The lift shot up like a rocket and then suddenly crashed. So if you've seen the end of that movie there, they literally crashed through the roof of the building, of the factory, in the glass elevator. I'm going to turn it around. You can see them right there. See closely. That's the elevator. This is them flying up the tower and then out the top of the building. And even on the back of this one, you can see down into the street, and then there they are, flying out of the building. Grandpa shouted, "Help! We're done for!" And Mr. Wonka said, "No, we're not. We're through. We're out." Sure enough, the lift had shot up through the roof of the factory and was rising into the sky. "How does this thing stay up?" said Grandpa Joe. "Sugar power," said Mr. Wonka. "Oh, look," he cried, pointing down. "There go the other children. They're returning home." The great glass lift was now hovering over the town. "How I love my chocolate factory," said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" asked Mr. Wonka. "Oh, yes," said Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world." "I am very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka. "You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place." "Giving it to him?" gasped Grandpa Joe. "But why?" "I've got no family," Mr. Wonka said, "so who's going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas." "So that is why you sent out the golden tickets," cried Charlie. "Exactly," said Mr. Wonka. "We must go and fetch the rest of the family. They can all live in the factory from now on." He pressed some buttons and the lift shot down toward Charlie's house. The lift was now hovering over the Bucket's little house. Crash went the lift right through the roof into the old people's bedroom. All right, so there's the little rundown house that Charlie lived in. When we open it up, you can see Charlie greeting his grandparents again. And the elevator went right through the roof. So I'm going to read first underneath the flap over here. "Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and spider and cement went raining down on the three old ones who were lying in bed. Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. 'Save us!' cried Grandma Josephine. 'Oh, it's only us,' said Grandpa Joe. 'Mother,' cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms, 'listen to what happened. We're all going to live in Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him run it, and he's given it all to me.' 'I'm so very glad to meet you,' said Mr. Wonka. It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone what had been happening to them all day. Charlie climbed into the bed to calm the old people. "We're going to have the most wonderful place in the world." "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandpa Josephine. "Anything to eat!" cried Charlie, laughing. "Oh, you just wait and see." And so there's Mr. Wonka's top hat, and then we open it, and there's his chocolate bar. And then he leaves. And then the next story, The Great Glass Elevator, is where they go when they leave the factory, and they've left his house also, and they get to go on this whole other journey, this adventure through the elevator, which is pretty cool too. So I love all Roald Dahl books. So hope you enjoyed it, and we'll have another pop-up book later. See you guys.